Welcome to the first lecture of a whole series of lectures on Europe and its citizens. And I must say I'm very proud as one of the co-organizers. Studium Generale organizes this lecture series together with the Faculty of Law, and it's partially financed by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to bring Europe closer to its citizens. Now, we want to choose lectures which give a very broad possibility for discussion. And I think to have chosen the issue of Europe and the Islam shows with the very large audience and a special speaker with Henryk Broder as the main speaker today, and Frans van der Velde, professor in Amsterdam at the Free University of Amsterdam, specialized in Islamic law. I think we have a very interesting possibility to discuss Europe and the Islam. Now, Henryk Broder is very known, specifically, and I would like to quote, because he will get the Ludwig Börne Prize 2007 of the jury, and they say, and I quote it first in German: Freier Geist, der leidenschaftlich und feurig schreibt, oft polemisch und ohne Rücksicht auf political correctness, aber immer unabhängig und überraschend. Now, a free spirit who writes with passion and with fire, often polemic and without any reference to political correctness, but always independent and surprising. Now, I hope precisely that we will have this. So, I welcome Henryk Broder for this opening lecture of the series Europe and its Citizens.
Guten Abend. I am really proud to be in Maastricht tonight, and Mrs. Schneider, thank you so much for this lovely introduction. I grew up in Cologne. This is a city very close to Maastricht, and I could only stay for 23 years in Cologne because Maastricht was around the corner. So whenever life became unbearable in Cologne, we jumped on the car and we came to Maastricht, and we spent some very good time here in the coffee shops of Maastricht, buying stroopwafels and hopjes and Pest and Geneva. And I think the first time that I smoked hashish, it also happened in Maastricht. Okay, it doesn't matter, it's a sin of my youth. But I also saw for the first time Herman van Veen in Maastricht. It was a beautiful performance in the theater. And I know some of you may not be too proud of him, but he is a great guy. I know Maastricht is the hometown of allure. So I have really a very sentimental and also emotional relation to Maastricht. I realized I've been here for the last time 16 years ago, around 1990, and so many things have changed, and Maastricht became nicer and nicer. I think it's one of the most beautiful European cities, and it makes me really proud to deliver the lecture tonight in Maastricht. First of all, before I start, I have to apologize for my lousy command of the English language. I grew up with Polish. Polish was my first language. My mother spoke Polish, my father spoke Polish, and I still speak Polish with my sister who lives in Paris. But it's a very poor Polish, but what remains is this melody I can't get rid of, you know. So every language I try to speak, or I attempt to speak, or I pretend to speak, still sounds very Polish. So I apologize for that, and I think you can cope with it. My topic tonight is it sound okay? Because I came a little bit deaf off the plane and I can't hear myself. My subject today is the last days of Europe. One of the epochal and most important works of the past century was Karl Kraus' tragedy in 5 acts with preamble and epilogue, The Last Days of Mankind, Die letzten Tage der Menschheit. Kraus worked on this magnum opus for a total of 7 years, from 1915 to 1922, and when he finally finished it and the play was published in book form, he declared it unperformable. In the foreword to the book version, Karl Kraus wrote, "The staging of this drama, which would take 10 evenings by earthly reckoning, is intended for a theater on Mars. Theater-goers of this world would not be able to bear it." Kraus refused offers to stage the play from well-known directors like Max Reinhardt and Erwin Piscator, but on January 15th, 1930, more than 70 years ago, the epilogue to the last days of mankind was performed at the Berlin Theater am Schiffbauerdamm, the famous Bert Brecht Theater, directed by Heinrich Fischer with music by the great Hans Eisler. Since then, every director brave enough to try his hand at it has failed. There have been some successful readings and also great sound recordings, including one with Helmut Qualtinger. Some of you may know him. In 1974, in honor of Karl Kraus' 100th birthday, Austrian radio produced The Last Days as a multi-part radio play with 160 actors, and so this production entered the Guinness Book of Records. Kraus assembled large portions of The Last Days from quotes, newspaper reports, military orders, and court decisions, Kraus' favorite material. In the foreword to the published version, he wrote about his method as follows: "The most unlikely deeds reported here really happened. I just portrayed what they did. The most unlikely conversations held here were literally spoken. The most outrageous inventions are quotes." Today, one would probably call it a soundbite collage, an approximation of the absurd using documentary means, and we would note that no theater production can compete with real life, because life is more absurd, crazier, more improbable. Take, for example, the fact that Libya, which is planning a memorial to the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein, now that he's lost both his power and his life, the same Libya for a time held the chairmanship of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. Apparently, North Korea and Zimbabwe were overqualified for that job. Or take, for example, the wonderful suggestion made by Günter Grass, our national poet, on the occasion of the German city of Lübeck's application to become an official European city of culture. Grass proposed turning one of Lübeck's churches into a mosque as a goodwill gesture toward the Muslims living in Germany, who only have 2,000 mosques, 80 of them in Berlin alone, at their disposal, and therefore really need another one that was once a church. But I don't want to go ahead of myself. Let me stick for the moment with Karl Kraus, who I hope will forgive me for naming him in the same breath as the man who took his life's work as the moral conscience of the nation so seriously that he forgot all about his brief guest appearance with the Waffen-SS. Another nice example, by the way, of life's truth being stranger than fiction. When Karl Kraus wrote The Last Days of Mankind, he knew that World War I would not spell the end of mankind, no matter how the war turned out. Somehow mankind would survive and life would go on. It was the end of mankind as Karl Kraus had known it. The end of the much vilified, but actually not so terrible, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the end of the casual arguments over banalities, the excessive excitement over wrongly placed commas that Karl Kraus loved so much, the excitement, not the commas, that he couldn't get enough of incorrect punctuation. For Karl Kraus, the last days of mankind were a sort of long solar eclipse, and the only thing he knew was that they would never end. Today, we know that there is no end of history, that World War I was only the dress rehearsal for World War II, and that the fall of the Berlin Wall was not only the end of an old confrontation, but the beginning of a new one, defined by the nice term asymmetrical warfare. A word that has many of us looking back nostalgically to a time when war was still a fair man-to-man fight, and the boys in the Kremlin and the White House simply reached for the red telephone in times of crisis. If I speak today with big love and deep respect to Karl Kraus of the last days of Europe, I don't mean that Europe will soon cease to exist, that the peninsula between the North Sea and the Mediterranean will simply break off along the Arkhangelsk, Moscow, Odessa axis and disappear into the sea. Also, that might be an attractive thought for many nature and animal lovers. I mean the Europe that you and I know, the ravaged continent that developed so astonishingly over the last 60 years, and especially in the last 15 years. I know it's in style to complain that times are getting worse and people getting stupider and stupider. The proof seems to be everywhere, but the evidence is misleading. In fact, the opposite is true. Times are getting better and people are getting smarter. They just don't know it or don't want to know it because every day they see apocalyptic films on television and read reports by Footwatch, Robin Hood and Attack. And because they take everything they have and want for granted. I, on the other hand, after 50 years in the West, I am still amazed at how many newspapers you can buy at every newsstand. I am excited that I can fly from Reykjavik to Rome without being stopped by a single border guard. As my family and me were driving home recently from Lake Garda to Bavaria, my daughter wanted to know when we are going to get to Austria. We had already passed it. It will be a long time before I get used to the fact that I can send mail anywhere in the world from an internet cafe in Tel Aviv or Amsterdam or Krakow and expect an answer. And that I only need a laptop, a digital camera and a mobile phone to work anywhere where there is an electric socket. But these are feelings of joy that I can only talk about with other people from Eastern Europe, with my friend Joachim Gauck from East Germany, or the author Richard Wagner, that's his real name, Richard Wagner, from Romania, or Mike Taylor from Ukraine, who wants to send his kids to the United States for college. My Western friends, even my wife and my daughter, don't understand me. Sometimes I feel like someone from a South Sea island who finds himself in the cold north and is the only one who is excited that the central heating works. Now, the central heating is slowly being turned down and it's getting colder in Europe. Not because Gazprom and Gerhard Schröder has raised the prices or throttled production, and not because everyone now is driving gas-guzzling SUVs and letting the air condition run all the day. It's getting colder in Europe because we are getting more cowardly. Not that we were ever particularly brave. If chance hadn't helped us along, the Berlin Wall would still be standing and we would still be emptying our pockets for the border guards on the transit highway through the GDR to Berlin. We are living through the last days of Europe as we know it. The question is not whether Europe is going downhill, but only how quickly it will happen. Will it take 1 or 2 generations before Europe becomes Eurabia or Eurasia? If I had a choice, I'd pick Eurasia, if only because I prefer Asian food. The question is not whether Europe is going downhill, but only how quickly it will happen. Will it take 1 or 2 generations before Europe becomes Eurabia or Eurasia? If I had a choice, I'd pick Eurasia, if only because I prefer Asian food. Some of you, I know, because I can read minds, are thinking this guy there is paranoid. It's true, I am paranoid, but that does not mean they are not after it. I am not imagining it, I really am being told more and more often and more aggressively to be tolerant, considerate, and cooperative towards people I don't know and who are neither cooperative nor considerate nor at all tolerant towards me. These days, it's the end of February, we celebrate the anniversary of an event you must not forget in case your grandchildren should ask you one day, Grandma and Grandpa, when and how did it all start? Then you have a choice. You could say, it started on September 30th, 2005, the day the Danish newspaper Jyllandsposten published a dozen cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad that were so harmless and innocent that it took months before anyone noticed them. Or you could say, it began the Danish embassies were attacked and burned in Beirut and Damascus. Or the day that thousands of ranting demonstrators took to the streets of London to protest the publication of cartoons they had not seen in a newspaper whose name they could not pronounce. And if you have really prepared yourself, you could show your grandchildren an 11-minute-long YouTube video of the demonstration on February 3rd, 2006 in London, in which masked demonstrators chanted, Allahu Akbar, Jihad in the name of Allah, may Allah bomb you, may Osama bin Laden bomb you, you will pay with your blood, bomb Denmark, Denmark, watch your back, bin Laden is coming back, and we want Danish blood. And where they carried hand-painted signs with slogans like Jihad against European crusaders, Europe you will pay, your annihilation is on its way, annihilate those who incite Islam, Europe you will pay, Mujahideen are on the way, and slay those who incite Islam. It was only one of many peaceful demonstrations from Islamabad to Rabat, London to Jakarta, whose participants took the Mohammed cartoons as an excuse to release pent-up resentments. They threatened, Europe would take some lessons from 9/11, be prepared for the real Holocaust, and behead those who incite Islam. My 2 favorite photos from those days show a woman in a veil whose poster reads, God bless Hitler, and a man with a sign reading, kill those who incite Islam, standing exactly between 2 London bobbies, escorting him all the way. You may ask why you didn't see those photos. I can tell you why I haven't seen those photos, very simply, because they were not published in any German newspaper. And I don't know, but I have my doubts whether they were published in a Dutch paper. You can only guess whether the newspapers were trying to protect their readers or just did not want to annoy them after they had failed to reprint the Mohammed cartoons. Except for 3 papers in Germany, Die Tageszeitung, Die Welt, and Die Zeit, which printed 1 cartoon each. All other German newspapers and magazines, unfortunately including the magazine I am working for, Der Spiegel, preferred to show responsibility rather than the cartoons by not publishing them. Did you notice that the debate exactly a year ago was a phantom debate about something almost no one had seen unless they subscribed to Jyllandsposten, which is not one of Europe's major newspapers? It was like deaf people discussing music, blind people talking about painting, impotent people debating sex. I brought with me the original page from Julian's Boston, and I know you can't see it from the back of the wall, but maybe you will come forward after the lecture and have a look at it. This is the page that almost triggered off the Third World War. And if you see the cartoons and you see the caricatures, you will realize one thing. It's strange. It's more than strange. They are so innocent. If the cartoonist and the editors of the paper are to be blamed for something, then only for the fact that they were printing and publishing totally harmless, innocent cartoons. Some of them are good, some of them are not so good, as usual with art and cartoons and things being published, but they are totally innocent. And every of these cartoons pales in comparison with everything that is printed every day today in Arab papers in reference to Europe, Christianity, or the Jews. This is totally innocent, this is nice, this is harmless. One caricature is my favorite one. This one. So you see the Mullah standing somewhere in the heaven, telling the guys on earth, stop sending martyrs. We don't have any virgins anymore. And this is so harmless. If you really, when I saw it for the first time, I couldn't believe it, because I thought, as everyone of us did, something terribly abusive must have happened. It's not abusive, it's harmless, it's lovely. It's something you can show to every 10-year-old girl. Never before had there been a debate like this, at least not during the time I remember, and this is at least the last 50 years. The prohibition on pictures of Mohammed, a prohibition that is controversial even within Islam, was adopted by the media in a kind of anticipatory obedience, not out of respect for Mohammed and Islam, but for fear of the raging mob which was able to get across the message to those who incite Islam with the help of the same media. For some, this submissiveness did not go far enough. Günter Grass, who had not yet gotten over his idea of turning the church into a mosque, spoke of a conscious, planned provocation by a conservative Danish paper which he labeled right-wing extremist on another occasion. He characterized the riots as a fundamentalist response to a fundamentalist act. A fundamentalist response to a fundamentalist act. The score, in other words, was 1-1 in a match between two fundamentalist teams. One had published a couple of cartoons, the other had torn to the global village like a firestorm. Grass' view of the situation was about as correct as someone claiming he had battled the Nazis side by side with the resistance members. But this did not stop him from stamping his feet more and more loudly from statement to statement. It wasn't enough for him to equate the Danish cartoonist with the Muslim mob, and in fact to place the mob in a morally superior position because it was merely reacting. Grass concluded, we have lost the right to seek protection from the right to freedom of expression, and we should not forget that there are places they don't have separation of church and state. Günter Grass, whose appearances are the best evidence that freedom of expression can protect all sorts of nonsense, Günter Grass also recommended looking at the cartoons carefully. They are reminiscent of the famous newspaper from the Nazi period, Der Stürmer. Der Stürmer published anti-Semitic cartoons in the same style. This is, ladies and gentlemen, what Grass claimed. Der Stürmer published anti-Semitic cartoons in the same style. One might blame this statement on the weakened sight and hearing of this somewhat elderly gentleman to whom everything that happens in the world is a challenge to prove his powers of judgment. But younger people, strange enough, were saying similar things. Fritz Kuhn, the chief of the Green parliamentary party in the Bundestag, said in an interview with Die Zeitung Die Welt that people had to begin talking about the relationship between freedom of expression and the responsibility that arises from it. Because, Kühn, many people feel stigmatized by the cartoons. They reminded me of the anti-Jewish drawings in the Hitler period before 1939. You must bear in mind, Fritz Kuhn was born in 1955. And for someone who was born in 1955, he must have a great memory of the time before 1939. Kuhn, who nevertheless is considered one of his party's more intelligent realists, never withdrew or modified this unspeakable sentence. And the Greens, usually the first to mount the barricades of virtual indignation when the Third Reich is trivialized, they never called him onto the carpet for it. How could they, when even the chairman of the Greens, Claudia Roth, took the same line? Claudia Roth called for prudence, not a culture war, and maintained that de-escalation starts at home. In this context, she criticized the so-called Muslim test in Baden-Württemberg. It's a kind of inquiry where people who are asking for citizenship are politely asked to answer some questions about their attitude towards the constitution. So Claudia Roth criticized the so-called Muslim test in Baden-Württemberg, saying, this test causes Muslims to feel stigmatized and generally suspected. Another glass of beer and Claudia Roth would have claimed that the demonstrations in Jakarta, Damascus and Tehran were not only protesting the Jyllandsposten cartoons, but also the Muslim test in Baden-Württemberg. The young CDU deputy Eckhard von Klegen admonished, we must not contribute to escalation. The CDU and the SPD, the two big main German parties, declared separately but in unison that dialogue with Islam must be strengthened shortly after demonstrators in Tehran had firebombed the Austrian embassy shouting, God is great, and Europe, Europe, shame on you. If one followed the events of those days closely, I mean it all happened the day before yesterday, exactly 1 year ago, if one followed the events of those days closely, one found oneself thinking of the great Bavarian doctor and writer Oskar Panica, sentenced by a Bavarian court in 1895 to a year in prison for offenses against religion for writing a satire about the Vatican called The Love Council, Das Liebeskonzil. Oskar Panica, a great thinker and philosopher, is also the source of the quote, when insanity becomes epidemic, it is called reason. Europe experienced an epidemic of insanity masquerading as reason. The Danish firm Arla Foods, which exports a considerable volume of its products, mainly cheese and yogurt, to Arab and Muslim countries, took out ads in 25 leading Arab papers distancing itself from the Mohammed cartoons. The Swiss firm Nestlé soon did the same, but went one step further, promising not to use Danish ingredients in its products. Also, no British newspapers had dared to publish any of its cartoons. Not one single British newspaper did it. British Foreign Minister Jack Straw called the publication unnecessary, insensitive, disrespectful, and wrong. British newspapers, not known for showing restraint in disseminating intimate details about the royal family, voiced regret over misdeeds they had not even committed. The Observer assured readers that heightened Islamic sensibilities are something we must take into account in the future. Faced with riots on its doorstep, the Daily Telegraph expressed respect for the Islam, this purest and most abstract of all monotheistic religions. Even the Times rationalized its restraint, saying, this is not appeasement, but responsible use of freedom of speech. Even the Times rationalized its restraint, saying, "This is not appeasement, but responsible use of freedom of speech." When a newspaper takes an act of self-censorship and turns it into evidence of responsible use of free speech, more is lost than just the last remnants of professional behavior and honor. The Vorwärts, one of the oldest SPD magazines and the paper of the SPD with a long, long tradition, the Vorwärts, which has historically been persecuted and banned more often than any other German newspaper, confused cause and effect, claiming that in the strange feud that the right-wing populist newspaper Jyllands-Posten has triggered with its reckless Mohammed cartoons, more was at stake than just press freedom. The Vorwärts wrote, "Of course, Jyllands-Posten has the right of free speech, but one must distinguish between a right and the moral use of that right. Jyllands-Posten abused press freedom, not in a legal, but in a political and moral sense." You may know that at Bismarck's time, the Vorwärts was outlawed, and when I read those lines in the Vorwärts, I thought Bismarck had done the right job. As varied as the details of the reactions were, they all had in common their origin in a sense of powerlessness and helplessness. Critical minds that a day before had agreed with Marx that religion is the opiate of the people suddenly found it necessary to be considerate of religious feelings, especially when they are accompanied by violence. As with Günter Grass' recommendation following the September 11 terrorist attacks, 2 days after the attacks he wrote, "The West should finally ask itself what it has done wrong." The Western civil society was a target rather than the jungle of indignation from which the jihadis took their strength. A veritable race ensued to find the boldest, most audacious, and most original excuses. Here are my 2 personal favorites. Peter Scholl-Latour, who may be known to some of you who watch German TV, because it's a really tough job to turn on the TV without watching Peter Scholl-Latour. Peter Scholl-Latour, an expert on Islam, the Orient, and good behavior, expressed his understanding for the response of insulted Muslims and then spoke of his own sensibilities. As a devout Catholic, I can say that when people mock the Christian religion on TV or in the newspaper, this also shocks me deeply. His younger colleague Franz Josef Wagner, my favorite columnist, he writes a daily column in the Bild-Zeitung, addressing all issues and always communicating with God. So Franz Josef Wagner voiced his solidarity with the insulted prophet, saying, "When we die, we want to travel on, as Christians, as Muslims, as Buddhists. I want to travel on and not to be made fun of like Mohammed." As a Jew, I am grateful that Franz Josef Wagner does want me along his post-mortal excursions. Thus, within a few weeks, a culture of fear, regret, and apology developed such as Germany had never seen before. Across the political, journalistic, religious, and scholarly spectrum, society stood as one, firmly determined to nip any distress to Muslims in the bud before it could reach them. The representatives of the Enlightenment responded like people threatened by a hurricane. They can't do anything against the power of nature, so they store provisions, food, nail the windows and doors shut, and pray that the storm will pass quickly. This may be the only option for natural catastrophes, but it does not work in a dispute with fundamentalists. Encountering no resistance only makes them more determined. Quite rightly, Islamic fundamentalists consider the West to be weak, decadent, and unwilling even to defend itself. Those who react to hostage takings and beheadings, massacres of people of different faith, and outbreaks of violence hysteria by calling for a dialogue of cultures deserve no better. But how can you expect decency and backbone from the freelance dissidents and notorious nonconformists who love to throw monkey wrenches into the machinery of the times, when even the leading mind of the first and most powerful global player, the Pope, believes he needs to de-escalate too? The Catholic Church took 359 years to rescind Galileo's conviction and rehabilitate the dissenter. They still haven't apologized to Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake exactly 407 years ago. But it took only 2 days for Benedict XVI to modify his Regensburg speech and voice regret over the misunderstandings it might have caused. It's true that the Pope, unlike Franz Josef Wagner, Nestles, or the Forwards, did not strew ashes on his head. But what he said came very close to an apology, and that is how it was understood all over the world. In contrast, we are still waiting in vain for major representatives of political Islam to apologize for the fatwa against Salman Rushdie or for burning down the Danish embassies in Damascus and Beirut. Military historian Martin van Creveld has coined the term asymmetric warfare. This term, asymmetric warfare, you know, refers to the impossibility of combating terror and terrorists by military means, because they do not obey any of the rules of the war, while the representatives of state power fight with their hands tied. First of all by the Hague and Geneva Conventions, and second of all by the public, which expects adherence to the rules, even in regard to terrorists who abide by no rules and opposes civilian casualties, even if they are non-uniformed combatants. This asymmetry is not limited to military matters. It typifies the entire dispute. In line with Chairman Mao's exhortation to punish one, educate 100, terror works by creating a background threat. The threat must, of course, be credible and convincing, not only rhetoric. That's why Daniel Pearl's beheading was filmed and placed on the internet, and why the murderer of Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh combined his deed with a warning to anyone else who failed to show Islam the necessary respect. You may know the quite famous German artist Hans Haacke. He is really a household name in Germany. I guess he is not so popular in Holland, but in Germany he is somewhat. For him, art is a means of participating in political discussions, getting to the heart of problematic matters in striking fashion and provoking controversy. He is a very smart, very intelligent guy, a very good artist, and a courageous man. Haacke accepts no taboos, except for one. In a long interview recently with Die Zeit, he was asked why he has done no works dealing with the role of Islam. Hans Haacke answered, I quote him, "And I won't be doing I don't be doing one anytime now. The relationship with Islam seems so complex and explosive to me that I don't dare. Too much explosive material has built up on all sides. You can't predict who might suddenly go crazy." The interviewer persisted. "Mr. Haacke, you said before that an artist can't be a coward," to which Haacke explained, "Not being a coward shouldn't be confused with being foolhardy. When I did critical pieces on apartheid or on Bush's policies, there was no reason to be afraid anyone would be risking life or limb. I knew the American National Guard wouldn't come in shooting." Haacke did not need to say who might appear unexpectedly on his doorstep if he criticized Islam. It was obvious. But he could not resist mentioning that Mohammed cartoons were not about free speech, but about provoking a religious minority in Denmark. He called his own attitude that of a detached observer, not cowardly, but wise. Not cowardly, but wise. In German it sounds even better. Nicht feige, sondern weise. There could be something in that if he had not otherwise taken any opportunity to speak his piece. A bit of violence seems to be helpful to turn cowardice into wisdom, like water to wine. Punish one, educate 100. And just a small step from active abstinence for wisdom's sakes, like practiced by Harker, to passive collaboration. The idea that one is acting wisely by quickly coming to an understanding with political Islam has long since entered the popular mindset. Some talk about a dialogue of equals, Dialog auf gleicher Augenhöhe, for which they will bend over backwards. Others talk about developing interfaces, Schnittmenge. Recently, Oscar Lafontaine, once the Social Democrat chairman and candidate for chancellor, talked about interfaces between left-wing politicians and the Islamic religion. In an interview with the former communist newspaper Neues Deutschland, Lafontaine said, "Islam is concerned with community and thus contradicts the concept of exaggerated individualism in the West that threatens to fail. The second point of contact is that devout Muslims are obligated to share. The left also wants the strong to meet the weak. Thirdly, in Islam, the prohibition on usury still plays a role, as it once did in Christianity, das Zinsverbot. At a time when the entire economy is in crisis because ideas of profit have become completely absurd, there are reasons for the left to enter into dialogue with the Islamic influenced world." Lafontaine called on the West to exercise self-criticism and express sympathy for Muslims' indignation. He said, "People in Islamic countries have experienced many humiliations. One of the most recent is the Iraq War. It's about raw material imperialism." In his search for interfaces, Schnittmengen, Lafontaine overlooked one important point. If there really were to be union between left-wing politics and Islamic religion, how long would he survive without his beloved sincere wine? His dialogue with the Islamic influenced world would take place with fruit juice and mineral water. If one wants to know what extremes are good for, if one wants to know what extremes are good for, one must go to extremes. Not that all the old utopians have failed, proving to be either monstrous misunderstandings or criminal enterprises, or new seduction has appeared on the utopian horizon, Islam. It's a simple, easily understandable system that offers a solution to many problems. A prohibition on interest instead of usury, community instead of individualism, sharing instead of cashing in. Of course, if this were true, Saudi Arabia would be a paradise on earth and not the most reactionary system in the world. Those most easily susceptible to these ideas are people who have, as the saying goes, danced at many weddings but haven't yet found a partner for life. Those have tried democratic socialism and totalitarian socialism but never found the answer they were seeking. You may not have heard that David Mamet, the founder of the National Socialist Movement in Great Britain, converted to Islam a few months ago and changed his name to Abdul Aziz Ibn Mamet. This is exactly the type of news I don't find in German newspapers, and I get you won't find in Dutch newspapers. The same papers that otherwise report on the most insignificant ecumenical events in the most insignificant small towns. The same papers that otherwise report on the most insignificant ecumenical events in the most insignificant small towns. Mayet, now over 50 and hardened by long stays in prison, published an essay entitled From Neo-Nazi to Muslim, in which he explained his reasons for converting. They mainly involve his antipathy towards the Western system, the system which worships materialism and believes in the Holocaust. One of the nicest quotes by Ibn Mayet is this one, where he explains his targets and his aims. This may be a long war of decades or more, and we Muslims have to plan accordingly. We must affirm practical jihad to take part in the fight to free our lands from the kuffar, the unbelievers. Jihad is our duty. What is noteworthy about Abdul Aziz Ibn Mayet's words is not only his hatred for the West and democracy and his commitment to jihad. What is especially noteworthy is how Mayet says, we Muslims. He has hardly jumped on the bandwagon when he is already making himself the conductor and examining his fellow passengers whom he despises as lackeys of the West. You might argue that Islam can't help it if someone like Mayet converts. That's true. But we still have to ask why a British Nazi would mutate into a Muslim. Why not a Hindu or Buddhist or Confucian? Why wouldn't he join the Baha'i, a very liberal and progressive religious community with roots in Islam? It must have to do with the interfaces, the Schnittmengen, is found between his political beliefs and the Islam of today. Carlos, the famous Carlos, real name Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, the top terrorist of the 70s and the 80s, the one who planned and carried out the attack on OPEC's headquarters in Vienna in 1975, Carlos too became a militant Muslim after being sentenced to life imprisonment by a French court in December 1997. In mid-2003, he published a book from prison entitled Revolutionary Islam, in which he explained and defended terrorism as a tool of class warfare. Carlos also voiced his support for Osama bin Laden and the September 11 attacks. Since 2005, he has been writing articles under his Muslim name, Salim Muhammad, for the Islamic newspaper Aylik, the illegal organ of the Great East Islamic Raiders Front, which is responsible for numerous terrorist attacks in Turkey. So Carlos, terrorist Carlos, has found a religious, or if you prefer, ideological or metaphysical justification for his acts. Whatever it is, Islam captivates many people, not only Oscar Lafontaine and Ilich Ramirez Sanchez, but also the rank and file of those searching for guidance. From July 2005 to June 2006, some 4,000 Germans converted to Islam. 4,000 Germans out of 80 million, that doesn't sound like a lot, but it was 4 times as many as in the same period of the previous year. And while in the past it was mainly women marrying Muslim partners who changed their religion, the motives have become more varied within the last year. Now I am always suspicious of converts. A while ago, in Kiryat Arba, near Hebron in Israel, I met a Nazi judge's son who had converted to Judaism. For him, the son of the German Nazi judge, it was the best way to free himself from the burden of German history, and at the same time give the finger to his Nazi father. What a cruel irony of history. The son of a Nazi judge becomes a Jew. But that was not enough for him. He could have converted, moved to Tel Aviv, and enjoyed life on the beach and the cafes. Instead, he had to be in Kiryat Arba, near Hebron, a place densely populated with fanatics, nutcases, and idealists in the West sense of the word. And that's where he lived, defending the right of the Jews to live anywhere in the Holy Land and saying things that may be nauseous, such as, in the past it was our turn, now it's the Palestinians' turn. And whatever he said, it was his father speaking through him. The conversion of Judaism, however, is a complicated and difficult matter. Judaism doesn't proselytize. It prefers to remain a small and exclusive club. In contrast, converting to Islam requires hardly more than a statement of intention. Judaism had 613 commandments and prohibitions which no one, not even the most pious, can follow. Islam, in contrast, is based on 5 easy-to-remember commandments: monotheism, ritual prayer, fasting on Ramadan, pilgrimage to Mecca, and charity to legitimize property. This is not only simply and easy, but also very appealing. If I were looking for a religious home, Islam would be an option I would seriously consider. What makes the whole thing more complicated is the fact that Islam is both a religious and a political faith. In fact, perhaps a political one first and then a religious one. To separate the one from the other, Bassam Tibi, a Syrian academic living in Germany, Bassam Tibi created a distinction between Islam and Islamism, not a great idea theoretically, but one that doesn't stand the test of practice, because experts can't even agree on the meaning of jihad. Is it inner effort or war against unbelievers, or maybe both, depending on who is calling for jihad and why? We are also told over and over that Islam prohibits suicide and that suicide bombers cannot be Muslims. But we are also told that it is not suicide if it targets enemies of Islam and if the perpetrator sacrifices his life and becomes a martyr. In this way, terror can be rationalized and any violent action justified as a sacred act. But there are some questions waiting for clarification. Are there really 72 young virgins in heaven waiting for the martyr, or is it only one 72 years old virgin waiting for her redemption? And so we keep hearing the argument. And so we keep hearing the argument we remember from the days of the Red Army faction, die Rote Armee-Fraktion. It's just a small radical minority that does not represent Muslims or Islam. There are 3 things to be said about that. First of all, of course, not all Muslims are terrorists. By pretty much every terrorist since September 11, 2001 has been Muslim. Second, what is or is not representative is not a question of surveys or polls or election results, but can be determined by looking at history, only in hindsight. It's not quantity that matters, but quality, and what's today known as sustainability, the terrible German word Nachhaltigkeit. The Nazis never had a majority, but they were still representative, and what they did in only 12 years continues to have consequences today. Third, the idea that violent Muslims are only a small radical minority is meant as a tranquilizer, but is nevertheless probably true. There is a great deal of evidence that the majority of Muslims want the same thing as the rest of the population: to live normally, work, shop, travel, occasionally pray, and get annoyed at what's on TV. But this normal majority is not able, or for whatever reasons of ethnic solidarity, is not willing to discipline the small radical minority which is allowed to terrorize them and to represent them publicly. The problem is not my Turkish grocer who sends his 5 children to good schools so they make something of themselves. The problem is the good guys in the majority society, die Gutmensch, whose willingness to ignore problems or rationalize them away has grown to absurd proportions. The problem is, to give you one recent and fresh example, the problem is the judges on the Administrative Court in Kassel, Hessischer Verwaltungsgericht, who recently decided that 4 officials of Mili Görisch, an organization officially considered hostile to the constitution, could keep their German citizenship even though they had concealed their membership in the organization when they were naturalized. The state of Hessen had rescinded the naturalization when it discovered the activities. The 4 guys sued the state and won before the Supreme Administrative Court of the state of Hessen. The court argued that the citizenship had not been obtained through trickery because they had taken the loyalty oath in good faith. The Hessen Minister of the Interior is now considering the appeal. Meanwhile, the 4 Mili Görisch members can continue their Islamistic activities as German citizens. The problem is not the Muezzins, whose prayers apparently disturb some Germans and I guess also Dutch citizens' peace and quiet. The problem is the public that hardly notices when a Turkish lawyer in Berlin is forced to close her office as a result of death threats that she takes seriously because she once barely survived an attempted murder. And guess who is after her life? Christian fundamentalists, nationalists, German xenophobes, crazy Kurds or Armenians. It's the fathers and husbands of the beaten and raped Turkish woman she has represented in court. The only organization that supports the lawyer, Seval Ateş, the lawyer who had to close her office because of the threats, was Berlin's Gay Lesbian Association, which probably didn't do her much good in her own community. We have become used to many things that you write off as the collateral damage of the multicultural society. That Salman Rushdie had to live in hiding for over 10 years while we carried on a kritischer Dialog with those who had issued the fatwa against him. That the Green member of the German Bundestag, Akin Deligers, required round-the-clock police protection after she called on Muslim women to take off their headscarves and was flooded with hate mail and death threats. That the French philosopher and Professor Robert Redeker has been forced to live like Richard Campbell, the fugitive, because he published a piece in the French newspaper Figaro dealing critically with Muslim reactions to the post-Regensburg speech, an act that was seen as an additional unacceptable slight. And we never ever discuss the constant readiness of many Muslims to feel insulted, offended and hurt because we know that even posing that question could insult, offend and hurt them, and we know the consequences of that. So what's the way out? If you can beat them, join them. The former Dutch Minister of Justice, Piet Hein Donner, declared that he could imagine introducing Sharia law in Holland if the majority of Dutch voters wanted it. My congratulations. And on the homepage of the Minister of the Interior in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia, just across the border, you will find an affidavit proving the compatibility of Sharia law with the German constitution, the basic law. So, it's quite possible that you are hearing a lot of I have told you for the first time. After all, it's possible to get through even the most unpleasant situations quite well if you just make your perceptions more selective. If you do what I've been doing for a long time, ignoring reality. The power of denial is not a Freudian invention, but a very useful human trait. It's also possible that you consider my claim that we are living through the last days of Europe before it becomes Arabia to be correct in principle, but grossly exaggerated. I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But I'm afraid it's a society that is too comfortable and too lazy to reproduce because the state can't provide complete security from cradle to grave is also too comfortable and too lazy to realize which achievements of the Enlightenment it should be defending. Freedom of opinion, freedom to travel, or just the freedom to redefine cowardice as wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, I may well be paranoid, but they are still after me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Well, I listened with great interest to your expose, and I have still some comfort for you. Recent linguistic studies of Quran have discovered that if you go to heaven, you will not find 72 virgins. That was a mistaken interpretation of Quran. Modern linguistic research turns out that it is a handful of dark blue grapes instead of pure virgins.
How disappointing.
Well, maybe less disappointing is too that although Quran forbids you to drink wine, you, with your German history, will certainly enjoy that beer is not forbidden. At least some experts explain Quran as if it only concerns wine and not beer, so you are able to get your beer instead of apple juice. But I must agree with you, we are facing a huge problem. Conflict in which religion is used as a weapon to gain power, and the cartoon problem is certainly an example where not primarily the religious problem, but political problem was at stake. It was taken over by political interest. As you mentioned, in Damascus, a European Union embassy was burned down, but it were not the people as such. It was the Syrian secret intelligence who pointed to people which building had to be burned. They were absolutely convinced that half a year before, the embassy just had moved to another building, and only the placards saying this is a European Union building were still on it. And which proves for me that it was not, at least in Damascus, not primarily a religious but a political play. If we express ourselves as advocates of worldwide peaceful coexistence, we cannot hide and run from Islam, as you in some of your books say, go to Australia or New Zealand or maybe Iceland and hope finding there a rescue. I can guarantee you that you will not find rescue there if you address the problem by hiding and running. We have to stay on the battlefield. We have to choose an intelligent strategy. Once on the intellectual battlefield, knowing that peaceful coexistence is our aim, we have to identify who are our opponents, our enemies, and who are our allies and friends, and declaring Islam in general to be our enemy, as I had sometimes the idea was one of your topics. Well, in my view, that's fighting the windmill of Don Quixote. In my view, our enemies are those who, as Muslims in this way, claim superiority by using Islamic text. Superiority, not in the first place over non-believers like us, but primarily over other Muslims, declaring them to be heretics if they do not join the idea of the reactionary Islamists. Takfir, naming a fellow Muslim an heretic, is a popular game nowadays between conservatives, and we should keep that in mind. And if the Islamists are our opponents, we should not forget that we also have allies, friends amongst Muslims. They need our support, our understanding, and only in that way we can probably and hopefully win the battle, win peaceful coexistence. And we as academics and students and journalists and media makers and politicians and co-workers and neighbors of Muslims, do we really know enough about the progressive Islam to be of help? We all know the word jihad, defending the faith, as the banner of the Islamists. But how many of you, how many of us know the word ijtihad? The same stem comes the same verb, jahada, which means to do your utmost best, but ijtihad as the logo of the progressists, which means adaptation of Islam to today's life. Are we really aware that Islam also has a progressive part, which is as old as the conservative and as old as Islam itself? And even in recent years, while the Western world was obsessively gazing at conservative Islam, important innovations based on ijtihad took place. Let me give some examples. In Egypt, as we know, the Sharia divorce is generally said to be women unfriendly, which it is. However, in 2000, Egypt made divorce almost as easy for women as it is for men by using ijtihad, by referring to a saying of the Prophet 14th century ago: woman, if you return your bride's gift, your mahar, to your husband, he has to let you go. And some years later, in 2004,
Light switch, what I was aware of, but I couldn't stop it, so.
Okay, here we are again.
This is better.
Yes. In 2004, the Moroccan family code was drastically revised using ijtihad in an attempt to align the Moroccan family law with the universal principles of human rights. This was an amazing and a fascinating result they reached. And less than a year ago, one of the leading scholars of today's Islam, in principle, originally a very traditional man, Hassan Abdurabi, foreman of the Sudanese Muslim traditionalists, made some revolutionary statements in BBC television on the interpretation of Quran. But he said that the prohibition of Muslimas, Muslim women, to marry non-Muslims was a false interpretation of Quran. Of course, directly was attacked by fatwas by his colleagues in Sudan, but nevertheless, he, as the leading scholar in Sudan, didn't say that without reason, because he was convinced that modern times asked for an adaptation of Islam to the needs of today. And he said even that the testimony of a woman was worth half that of a man was absolutely stupidity. That if a woman is an expert in the field, you have to give her much more value than the testimony of a man who is maybe not an expert. And returning to our battlefield, we might ask ourselves if we have already identified all our allies, all our friends. And here I would like to point at the contribution made by progressive Muslim women. We all heard that in Canada, in Ontario, there was a proposal to introduce Sharia on the basis of arbitration. This plan luckily failed, not by Western scholars, not by Canadian politics, but by whom? By Muslim women organizations who said this is absolutely against our interest. This is not what the Islam should be in nowadays time. Well, and if you have our allies and our opponents, we regretfully also have our fifth column. As you know, in the Spanish Civil War, this column was a very important part of the game. We have it here too, and who are the fifth column, in my view? That all the politicians and all the journalists and all the media makers who proclaim to know about Islam, but really do not have the slightest idea of it. Well, many of you know that about a year ago, our Queen visited the oldest mosque in The Hague. And she didn't shake hands with this man. And the state, it's called propaganda, said this is the rule in Islam, which is absolutely nonsense. There are some side authors from the Middle East who once said it, but that's absolutely not accepted by the great author in Islam. Nevertheless, what do we see? Some months later, women, Muslims, being teachers at school, said, from now on, I do not shake hands anymore. I learned from the newspaper that this is the rule in Islam. I do it. And you see, we have really fifth column. Fifth column, if you listen to our politicians in The Hague, again and over again, we can experience this lack of knowledge. And exactly, it's not. Not all of us can become Islamologist or whatever. Me myself, I'm a lawyer, I'm foremost, and I study Islam from a legal point, but not from a general Islamic point, Islamological point. But nonetheless, now I do not dare to say too much in a too abstract and too definite way about how Islam is. I know Islam has many faces. That's for sure. To conclude my observation, I like to stress that we in Europe, if we want human rights and peaceful coexistence to continue as cornerstones of the European community, we more openly have to accept that Europe has become a multicultural society, and in the virtual battle we have to face in a more intelligent way who are our friends and who are our opponents. That's